enjoy racing games quite a bit. Not all of them, mind you, but a lot of them. In fact, one of my all-time favorite games, and one that I've mentioned on the channel before, is Rock and Roll Racing. And while at some point I'll be reviewing the Genesis version of Rock and Roll Racing, I'm saving it for a special occasion, where I first fell in love with the game was on the Super Nintendo, which is where the game actually made its debut before being ported to that Genesis version. Heresy, yes, I know, feel free to throw tomatoes at the screen if it'll make it feel better. I mean, I certainly don't have to clean up your living room. But in all seriousness, regardless of the original platform, Silicon and Synapse, who would later become Blizzard, got the game right the first time and created a perfect blend of music, racing, and action with a dystopian, darkly humorous sci-fi feel. If you've never played Rock and Roll Racing, I strongly encourage you to pick up the Blizzard Arcade Collection, which is available for all current major platforms, because it's got the best possible version of the game, along with Lost Vikings and Blackthorn, two other games that I'm looking forward to getting to review on the channel at some point. Rock and Roll Racing was so great that I needed to have a sequel to it. Interplay would eventually fill that void themselves, as Blizzard had slightly more important things to deal with, and released Red Asphalt, aka Rock and Roll Racing 2 in 1998. It was okay, but you could tell it was a product of a different development team, so it didn't quite hit the mark. But that was 1998. What about all of those years between the release of those two games, while I was anxiously awaiting what would be yet another disappointing sequel in my life? Yeah, it's happened a few times. Well, there was another game that looked like it could maybe fill that void, but unfortunately, I never got the chance to actually play it for myself, until now. However, I should probably pause for a second, because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are confused because you didn't realize that Blizzard actually made other games besides Worlds of Warcraft. Go outside, I beg you. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm all about making timely references to South Park episodes from 18 years ago. Yikes. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. That other game is the one we're taking a look at this week. MegaRace was released exclusively in North America for the Sega CD in December of 1994 and published by the Software Toolworks, who you might remember from the Software Toolworks Star Wars Chess that we reviewed back in episode 122. However, that exclusivity I just mentioned is specifically regarding the region of the Sega CD release, as the game also made appearances on DOS-based computers and 3DO, which is actually where I know the game from, because that 3DO version came out 7 months earlier in May of 1994. In fact, for a long time, I didn't even know there was a Sega CD version, as I only knew the game from magazine ads and brief sequences of MegaRace host Lance Boyle cut into 3DO commercials. But now, I get to do one of my favorite things on this channel and check out a game that I missed out on when it was originally released on the market. Is the Sega CD version going to hold up and make me regret not playing it all those years ago to fill that rock and roll racing sized void? Or is this game all next-gen 32-bit 3DO Flash and now stripped down to work on the 16-bit Sega CD? Well, we shall see, but first a look at this brand new, freshly unsealed package. And here's my copy of MegaRace for the Sega CD. As you'll immediately notice, it's not sealed. I went ahead and opened it a few days ago to start preparing for the review. Just to go ahead and get this out of the way, I specifically bought this copy of the game to play, not to slab, and it being sealed just happened to be a nice bonus. To those of you out there that think I should have not opened it up, I do respect that viewpoint, but that's not really the point of the channel. The goal here is to try to get a feel for what it's like to play and look at these games as they were originally produced and sold, and you can't get much closer to that experience than opening up a copy that has never been played. And also, there was about a ½ inch hole in the plastic on the front, so it's not like it was a mint seal. Now that that's out of the way, with this being a formerly sealed copy, the condition here is about as good as it gets, minus one of those stress fractures on the front cover. Even with a sealed copy, these large format jewel cases are just incredibly fragile. Obviously, I'll be keeping this copy in the collection, but if you happen to want one for yourself, they're currently going for around $50 complete, which is actually a bit more than I was expecting. I think I only paid $35 for this a few years ago. As far as the cover goes, I think this looks sharp. I like the diamond plate background, and the actual art inset makes the game look exactly like what I'm looking for: futuristic driving with explosions, and that tagline is pretty great. In this future, speed that kills isn't enough. As mentioned, with this being a region exclusive, there's no other Sega versions to compare it to, but there is the 3DO version, which is basically the same cover minus the Sega CD on the side, and then the PC version, which focuses just on the inset, and that's probably the best of the bunch, but they're all about the same. Flipping over the back, and there's a lot of info back here. 4 screenshots from the game, of course, including a shot of your host Lance right at the top. The screenshots look pretty good for a Sega CD title, so I'll be curious to see once I start playing it if perhaps some of these have been doctored a bit, as we've seen on the past with other full motion video based games. As far as the text goes, there's another great tagline at the top. This is the ride of your life, or death. And then some solid flavor text, followed by some bullet points that still lean into hyping the game, but they should have slowed their roll a bit because weaponry isn't the word that I think they were going for, seeing as how, well, it's not a word. Opening up the case, and everything here is in perfect condition as expected, with the original foam pad doing its job. The rear cover of the manual has ads for the aforementioned Star Wars chess and the animals, an edutainment title that I'm not exactly looking forward to reviewing, but who knows, maybe it'll be interesting at least. Inside the manual, the game is fully explained, although there's not really a whole lot to go over. I think if I had one complaint, it would be that I liked for this section that has the details for the symbols on the track to be a bit more detailed, because on some of these, it's hard to tell the difference between the good version of a symbol and the one you want to avoid. But with it being in black and white, I'm not sure that it would have made a difference anyway. I do like how there's write-ups on each of the 15 tracks, however. That's a nice touch. Okay, that's this nice, fresh package. Let's spin this disc up for the first time and see what I've been missing all these years. As you probably gathered by the name of the game and the intro section, MegaRace is indeed a racing game. Well, sort of. It's a racing game inasmuch as you're driving a car on a track and you can control your movement from left to right. And you can control if you're using the gas or the brake. Oh, and there's other vehicles on the track, and you only have a fixed amount of laps to try to win the race, with win being in quotation marks there. But even if you ignore the combat aspect of the game, it's definitely not a traditional racing game. The reason why I say that is because of how the game works at a base level. I mentioned rock and roll racing a lot in the intro, and while there's definitely some correlations here between the two games thematically, from an actual driving perspective, the games couldn't be more different. With rock and roll racing using an isometric view, similar to, say, RC Pro-Am, and MegaRace using a more traditional behind-the-car view that, ironically, Rock and Roll Racing 2/Red Asphalt would switch to using years later. But even then, MegaRace operates differently from your average racing title. The reason for that is how the track is presented. In most driving games, whether you're talking about super scalar arcade games that use 2D sprites, or 3D-oriented titles, like say a Wipeout or a Daytona, there's a direct correlation between the speed your car is traveling at and how quickly the background moves as you progress down the track. This is what provides the player with a sense of speed and largely influences how they drive, if they need to slow down for a turn, or if they need to potentially be more aggressive to try to pass someone else on the track. In fact, I'd largely say that the sense of speed is probably the most important part of what makes a racing game, and why something like Hard Drivin' or Race Drivin' falls apart on their home versions due to the low frame rate removing that feeling of going fast, regardless of what the speed limit signs might say on the side of the road. MegaRace instead is what I would refer to as a green screen racing title. That might sound a little confusing at first, but hopefully with the game footage playing in the background it'll make sense. The reason for that is because rather than racing on a track that's animated or displayed as you're traveling down it, the track is presented as a 3D rendered full motion video in the background, and you're driving on top of that video with your car always progressing down the track, since the video is playing the entire time that you're racing. I feel like I've played another game before that felt like this, and maybe I'm forgetting a better example, but honestly, the closest thing I can compare it to is a high-tech version of a Tiger Electronic handheld LCD game. The only real sense of speed that's given off comes from the other inhabitants of the track, namely the gang members that you're trying to catch up to and blow up, and then also the various power-ups and power-downs that appear as you're completing laps. Even then, due to the lack of animation used, everything just kind of appears to float on top of the screen. What's worse is the way that the game has to fake you being on a track. It ends up causing fairly large collision issues. When you or an opponent are toward the middle of the screen, usually the hitboxes seem to work appropriately, and you can attack or run into another driver pretty much as expected. But if you're closer to the edge of the track, things start to get a bit iffy, and then this goes double for trying to collect power-ups, which sometimes are impossible to trigger at the sides of the screen unless you're perfectly lined up over them. And if you're on one of the tracks that has a corkscrew, well, it's best to just enjoy the ride for a few seconds, because nothing is going to work correctly until you're back on flat land. I just mentioned the power-ups there, and that's something that definitely needs a bit of discussion. When discussing the manual, I felt like the power-up section could have been described a bit better, because from the pictures, it was difficult to tell what you should be targeting and what you should be avoiding, because there are definite power downs as well. This isn't Mario Kart, and you don't want to just be trying to run over anything that you see. I actually like that concept because it keeps players engaged and gives them another thing to focus on while driving, which is pretty important since there's only ever one opponent on the screen at the time, but more on that in a minute. If you're like me and you have trouble making heads or tails of that chart, or if you don't have the manual at all, it actually is pretty simple for the most part. If it's white, it's good, and if it's colored or black, it's bad. Once you get that down, it definitely makes navigating the track easier, but still frustrating due to the aforementioned hitbox issues depending on where things are on the track. Of course, once you figure out the white good, black bad thing, and assuming you can figure out how to position your car so that you're actually getting the power-ups you want and avoiding the ones that you don't, you still have to learn what each of these 17 different symbols do. And if having 17 different power-up, power-down symbols seems excessive and complicated for 3-lap races that are over in just a minute or two each, well, you'd be correct. This is where MegaRace's greatest sin lies, and considering how I've been somewhat negative so far, you'd be right to say, oh Lord, what now? Well, the issue is that for a racing game, there's just not really that much gameplay here. No, in MegaRace, at least specifically in the Sega CD version, you're going to spend the vast majority of your time doing one of two things. You're either going to be watching a video of Lance Boyle yuck it up, or you're going to be looking at a lovely black screen that just says, please wait, in the middle, while the blisteringly fast single-speed CD-ROM of the Sega CD does its thing. Now, to be clear, I actually quite like Lance's scenes, which feature actor Christian Eriksen. Eriksen's had a career that dates back to the 70s, and somewhat amazingly is still active, having just appeared in Demi Moore's latest horror thriller, The Substance. Pretty impressive for a guy that looked like he was in his 60s 30 years ago. However, the problem with full-motion video titles is, no matter how good the acting is, or if it's bad enough to be good, the videos are only going to be interesting to see so many times, and you'll find yourself pretty quickly starting to skip them, just to get back to that black please wait screen, again and again. I suppose if you're playing the game via some sort of modern convenience, like say an EverDrive,
the loading times won't be so concerning, but since I'm reviewing the game as it lies, so to speak, this is something that has to get brought up because it's something that gamers back in the day would have had to deal with. Compounding the issues of the frequent stops for loading is how the game is structured. Picture this: you boot up the game, you go through the first few intro videos, and finally get loaded into the first track in New San, the Blade Runner 2049 futuristic version of San Francisco that serves as one of 5 backdrops for the tracks in the game. You race for, let's just say, 83 seconds, because that's how long the background video for that first track is, assuming you don't defeat the track boss before that or get blown up in the process. You don't win, so it's back to Lance with, "Aw shucks, let's get the next contestant in here," and your game is over. Unless you perhaps make a stop at the high score screen. After that, the game starts all the way over. So not only do you have to skip past any Lance intro scenes, you also have to get past the Software Toolworks and Cryo Interactive Entertainment scenes as well before you even get to Lance. All that to race the same 83-second segment, lose because you haven't figured out which car to use yet or where the power-ups on the track are, and then have to do it all again. I clocked it, and it takes just over a minute even if you skip all the scenes to get back to that process. The best case scenario here is that you actually win a race or two, save your game, but even then you lose, and then it's this whole process again just so you can get into the game and load your save game to get back to where you were. I suppose if you were playing using that aforementioned EverDrive or a modern PC, it's not the end of the world because you're not having to stare at that please wait screen all the time, but I just can't imagine them testing this back in the day and thinking that this was acceptable. Would it have been so hard to at very least add a continue option so that you're not having to do all that backtracking just to get back into the game? I guess the devil advocate's position there is that the actual gameplay is so limited that if players could just continue and not go through all that they'd beat the game far too quickly and move on to something else. But I can't see justifying this madness. Didn't they want players to actually like, playing the game, regardless of how long it took? Let's pretend you're playing the game in the best case scenario and that the loading times aren't an issue. I've already mentioned the power-up system, and I think it's clear that the goals are to try to destroy the boss of the local gang's car before the race is over. In MegaRace, though, this means destroying all of his underlings before getting to him one at a time, because the game engine can only display 2 cars on the screen at once. What a concept. It's not like 1986's World Grand Prix on the Master System supported racing 2 opponents at once or anything. But I digress. Having said that though, there's 2 ways to make it through these waves. You can either shoot your opponents or attempt to sideswipe them. Sideswiping doesn't do much damage, so you're better off trying to use your guns, unless you run out of energy to fire them, which is a pretty common occurrence due to not just limited energy, but also the energy power downs on the track, which you most likely will hit at some point. Either way, run out of energy before taking out the gang boss, and your only real hope is to possibly find an energy up on the track, or else you'll just be driving to the end of the race, impotent and frustrated. Insert your own joke there. To try to combat this and make things more interesting, the game does feature up to 8 different cars to drive, assuming you unlock all of them first, with each having different statistics and even custom dashboards, to really give them all a different look and play experience. I appreciate the effort here, and your car choice does make a slight difference, but honestly, some of the different dashboards make it more difficult to keep up with what's going on, and this is a situation where maybe the cars should have had more drastic differences to gameplay, but maybe had a more similar display. Also, curiously, when selecting cars, each one has 4 red boxes beside it, which seems to indicate that maybe at some point the cars could be powered up with some sort of purchased add-ons, like in Rock and Roll Racing or Super Off-Road, but then that feature was cut due to development constraints. I think I've beat to death the gameplay at this point, so let's focus on the graphics and sound for a bit. The graphics are actually better than I was expecting, outside the actual game that is. The videos are full size, so there's not the small window FMV that other titles try to get by with. And honestly, they're pretty comparable to how the videos look like on other versions of the game. It's clear that they're not as colorful, so some detail is lost due to that, but honestly, if I was going to complain about the graphics in comparison to the other versions of the game, it wouldn't be the video sequences. No, where there's a clear step down is the gameplay sections. If you compare the 3DO or PC versions of the game to the Sega CD, you'll quickly notice that the cars are much smaller in the Sega CD version. It's not a big deal, but clearly MegaRace was trying to make a splash as a next-gen title, and when they had to try to make it fit on the Sega CD, some of those flashy graphics had to get downgraded a bit, and that means no more large car sprites that look like they came from an arcade game. The track also loses some detail as well due to the aforementioned color limitations on the console, but that's not as big a change as the size of the cars. With this being a Sega CD title, you'd probably be expecting better than average audio, and I think that's accurate, with my son even popping his head in the room and wondering what I was playing because it sounded better than what I usually played. The background music in game is very techno-synthy and fits the dark future theme of the game very well, and the intensity matches the screen racing action and combat. The sound effects aren't quite as good. I mean, they're fine, but I don't think they're anything special, and seem like any other sound effects you might hear in a Genesis game, with really just some explosions, laser beam sounding shots, and the screech of tires as you go around the track. I do have to mention one thing though, and while it's possible that it was my setup, I'm not sure, because I also heard similar weirdness when playing the PC version, but the videos with Lance tend to stutter a decent amount during audio playback. It doesn't ruin the game, but it is noticeable, and I just ended up pretending that I was watching Lance do a impression of Max Headroom or something. If I had to sum up MegaRace in one word, it would be disappointment. I let off the review talking about one of my favorite games of all time in rock and roll racing, and while MegaRace definitely carries some of the same themes and ideas of that game, and even expands upon the dystopian future aspect with a game show idea that was clearly inspired by the Running Man, the actual game execution is simply lacking. Beyond that, the Sega CD version specifically just isn't up to the quality of the other ports due to the limited hardware resources, and even though Cryo Interactive Entertainment clearly tried their best, this is a game that I think should have been scrapped rather than try to make money off of kids that couldn't afford a 3DO or a nice multimedia PC at the time. As a result, I'm giving MegaRace 1 star, but if you're using an EverDrive or something similar, then maybe bump it up to 2, as that will at least solve the load time issues.
And that's it for MegaRace on the Sega CD. I ended up putting a lot more time into this review than I was originally planning, and you can probably tell by the length of the video. Sorry about that. I'm sure I probably could have cut out a few minutes here or there, but I didn't just also play the Sega CD version for this review. No, I played the 3DO and PC versions as well, and I can honestly say if you really want to play this game, don't play the Sega CD version. Go to GOG.com and get the MegaRace 1 and 2 pack for 89 cents. That's the best way to play this game by far, and 89 cents these days is almost free. Next time on the channel, it'll be our Halloween video, so with an open slot on the schedule, I decided to pick something that's a horror classic, at least in its original book form. I'm not so sure about the movie based on the book or the game based on the movie, both of which I'll be taking a look at for the first time over the next few days in preparation for episode 258. Although, to be perfectly honest, I'd rather be watching the Mel Brooks take on the subject, and based on what I've heard, I may have to as a palate cleanser after playing this one. Or maybe I could make espresso. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 257. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later! Oh, and P.S. R.I.P. to Paul Diano. Go play Killers. You know, just in his memory. You won't regret it.